Hey kids and folks, welcome back to chapter 13 of the Chaplains and Clergy of the Revolution by J.T. Headley. It was published in 1864, and I got to tell you is that, I don't know if you'll remember this or ask your moms and dads about it, but tell you what, Nana made some outstanding cookies. We're doing this right now about first part of December, and guess what she's doing? She's making cookies and stuff. So anyway, if you're ever interested in some really super, these chocolate nut, cherry smoked yellow hot pepper, cookies, amazing. And then ginger snap with the yellow hot peppers that Papa grows. Man, I'm telling you, they're outstanding. But anyway, you got to have fun, right? We always have fun. So with that, let's get back here to chapter 13 of the Chaplains and Clergy. One of the things that I want to let you know is that it is very, very disappointing in our day and age that so many of the churches and the pastors and the seminaries and all of that have walked away from the way that the gospel was taught as it was during the foundation of this nation. Very, very sad, very terrible in that it's not like it was at that time. And it's something that you have to pick up. You have to get in there and study scriptures, and then what you have to do is you have to study what these men studied to understand that foundational truth. Now, I'm going to warn you, and I'm going to warn everybody, that this of Thomas Allen gets pretty graphic, okay? It gets pretty serious and a very, very graphic tale. So chapter 13, we'll get with it, of the Chaplains and Clergy of the Revolution, compiled by J.T. Headley, 1864, and this is Thomas Allen. And here's what's in this chapter. His birth and education, he settles in Pittsfield, takes decided part with the Colonies, is made chairman of the Committee of Safety and Correspondence. His labors, his interest in the Conquest of Ticonderoga, new and interesting letter to General Seth Pomeroy, helps to furnish Knox with an ox train to carry cannon to Boston, joins the army as chaplain, his diary at the Battle of White Plains, goes to Ticonderoga, his address to the soldiers when momentarily expecting an attack from Burgoyne, leaves the army in disgust at the retreat, rallies the militia to the aid of Stark at Bennington, his interview with him, summons the enemy to surrender and is fired at, fights in the ranks, first over the breastwork, his care for the wounded, returns to his parish, dialogue with the parishioner, puts out the flash, goes to Georgia after his brother's widow, voyage to England after an infant grandchild, prays with and addresses the crew in expectation of an attack, his conduct in the Shay's rebellion, his statesmanship, and his death. Some of the clergy who were deeply engaged in the Revolution kept a record of the stirring scenes through which they passed, and left letters and documents that are still preserved with religious care by their descendants, and which have a priceless value in the eyes of the historian. The pleasure of pursuing them, however, is sadly diminished by the regret they awaken that so much similar material has been lost through accident, want of proper care, or appreciation of its true worth. The descendants of the subject of the following sketch are among the fortunate few who possess such documents and memoranda saved from the wreck of the past. Among the patriotic clergymen of New England, none occupies a higher rank than Thomas Allen of Pittsfield, who was born in Northampton January 17th, 1743. An uncle, whose name he bore, having bequeathed to him a sum sufficient to provide for his education, he commenced his studies early in life, and at 19 graduated with high honor at Cambridge. He was only 21 when he was ordained pastor of Pittsfield, then a frontier town on the western borders of Massachusetts. He was the first minister ever settled in the place, which was then a rude collection of log huts, with the exception, perhaps, of a half a dozen framed houses. In 1768, he married the daughter of Reverend Jonathan Lee of Salisbury, Connecticut, by whom he had 12 children, many of whose descendants at this day shed luster on the state that gave them birth. He was of middle height and slender frame, yet strong and active and capable of great endurance. His frank, open countenance was lit up by a keen and piercing eye. Ardent in his feelings, hating wrong, and scorning opposition, he became deeply enlisted in the cause of the colonies from the commencement of the struggle to the redress of grievances, while his zeal and ability made him a leader in all the measures taken to resist the encroachments of the mother country. Hence, in June 1774, when the selectmen of the town called a town meeting, and 7 men were appointed a standing committee of safety and correspondence, he was chosen chairman. This position brought him into correspondence with the leading patriots of the state, and in the commencement of the Revolution was one calling for great activity and labor. Though earnest and eloquent in his appeals, he was a man of deeds rather than words, and gave his time and energies to the carrying out the practical measures. When the expedition against Ticonderoga was being organized, he took a deep interest in it, and wrote letters to Seth Pomeroy at Cambridge, not only keeping him informed of what was going on in the western part of the state, but suggesting plans of future action. He helped to unravel plots against the patriots, caused some to be sent to jail, and drove others with, quote, hue and cry, end quote, out of the region. He traveled over into New York, bringing back the disaffected and stirring up rebellion on every side. The conquest of Canada, at this time, seemed to occupy the attention of military leaders almost as much as the defense of our seacoast, and Ticonderoga and Crown Point being regarded as the key to it, their capture became of vital importance. It was necessary, however, that any expedition against them should be conducted with great secrecy, or reinforcements from Canada would be hastened down to garrison them more effectually. Mr. Allen thus refers to the expedition that was finally set afoot. And he's writing this letter, and the letter is Pittsfield, May 4th, 1775, to General Pomeroy. Sir, I have the pleasure to acquaint you that a number of gentlemen from Connecticut went from this place last Thursday morning, having been joined by Colonel Easton, Captain Dickinson, and Mr. Brown, with 40 soldiers on an expedition against Ticonderoga and Crown Point, expecting to be reinforced by men from the grants above here, a post having previously taken his departure to inform Colonel Ethan Allen of the design, and desiring him to hold his Green Mountain boys in actual readiness. The expedition has been carried on with the utmost secrecy, as they are in hopes of taking the forts by surprise. He expects they will reach these forts by Saturday next or Lord's Day at the farthest. The plan was concocted at Hartford last Saturday by the Governor and Council, Colonel Hancock, Mr. Adams, and others from our province being present. 300 pounds were drawn immediately out of the treasury for the aforesaid purpose and committed to those gentlemen who were here. We earnestly pray for success in this important expedition, as the taking of those two places would afford us a key to all Canada. There is, if the accounts are to be depended upon, not more than 20 soldiers at each fort. There are a large number of cannon, and I hear 4 as excellent brass cannon as we could wish. Should success attend the expedition, we expect a strong reinforcement will be sent from the western part of Connecticut to keep those forts and to repair and fortify them well. We have had much work here of late with the Tories. A dark plot has been discovered of sending names down to General Gage, in consequence of which, and the critical situation of the times, we have been compelled to act with vigor, and have sent Mr. Jones and Graves to Northampton Gaol, where they now lie in close confinement, and have sent them a hue and cry after Major Stoddard and Mr. Little, who have fled to New York for shelter. So let me explain that the Northampton Gaol was the jail. That's how they said it. G-O-A-L is really a jail. So, we hope it will not be long before they are taken into custody and committed to close confinement. Continuing the letter. Our Tories are the worst in the province. All the effect the late and present operations have had upon them is they are mute and pensive, and secretly wish for more prosperous days to Toryism. As to your important operations, sir, you have the fervent prayers of all good men with that success may attend them. I hope God will inspire you with wisdom from above in all your deliberations, and your soldiers with courage and fortitude, and that Boston will speedily be delivered into your hands. The general thereof, and all the king's troops, that den of thieves, that nest of robbers, that asylum for traitors and murderers, may be broken up, and never another redcoat from England set foot on these shores. I have been concerned lest General Gage should spread the smallpox in your army. May heaven protect your army from this wicked wiles. May you be shielded, sir, in the day of battle, and obtain a complete victory over those enemies of God and mankind. I have but one observation to make, which I have often made upon the histories I have read, and then I must put an end to this tedious epistle. It is this: seldom or never do the great generals improve a victory when it is obtained. I am, with great respect, your humble, obedient servant, Thomas Allen. It's the end of that letter. The young divine, chairman of the Committee of Safety and Correspondence, is closely watched, and his name sent down to General Gage as the most dangerous character to the king's cause in the western part of the colony. He is a marked man, and his clerical profession, his clerical profession will not save his neck from the halter, that means to be hung, if he once falls into the hands of the enemy. But instead of being alarmed by these secret efforts to accomplish his destruction, he marks the conspirators, puts some of them in chains, and drives others over the border in a fright. Though by profession a man of peace, in this great struggle he is a man of blood. Active and keen, his knowledge extends everywhere, and his blow falls quick and sudden as a bolt from heaven. Plotting Tories are struck in the midst of their conspiracies, and while they are sending his name to General Gage for future reference, he sends them to prison. The closing sentence of this letter is significant. He is afraid of temporizing measures, that victory would be followed by delays, in hopes of adjusting matters without farther bloodshed. His theory is the one Bonaparte carried out triumphantly. Follow up a successful blow with strokes so rapid that the staggered enemy will not have time to recover. It is a delicate hint and well worth attending to. His letter reveals a characteristic that belonged to all the patriotic clergy of that day: belief that faith and works must go together, while leaving no stone unturned to secure the ends he has in view. He yet looks upward for the blessings of heaven, without which all his labors, he knows, will be in vain. 5 days after this, he writes again to General Pomeroy, evidently in answer to a letter he has received from him asking for information. This correspondence shows that Mr. Allen was looked upon as the leading patriot in that part of Massachusetts where he resided, and that in addition to the duties of the parish, he had on his shoulders the charge of the political movements of the county. The second letter to General Pomeroy is dated Pittsfield, May 9th, 1775. In the opening, to General Pomeroy. Sir, I shall esteem it a great happiness if I can communicate any intelligence to you that shall be of any service to my country. In my last I wrote to you of the northern expedition. Before this week ends, we are in raised hopes here of hearing that Ticonderoga and Crown Point are in other hands. Whether the expedition fails or succeeds, I will send you the most early intelligence, as I look on it as an affair of great importance. Solomons, the Indian king at Stockbridge, was lately at Colonel Easton's of this town, and said that the Mohawks had not only given liberty to the Stockbridge Indians to join us, but that had sent them a belt, denoting that they would hold in readiness 500 men to join us immediately on the first notice, and that the said Solomons holds an Indian post in actual readiness to run with the news as soon as they shall be wanted. Should the Council of War judge it necessary to send to them, after being better informed of the matter by Captain Goodrich, now in the service, if you should issue out your orders to Colonel Easton, I make no doubt that he would bring them down soon. The Indians might be of great service should the king's troop march out of Boston, as some think they undoubtedly will upon the arrival of their recruits, and give us battle. Our militia this way are vigorously preparing for actual service. Adjacent towns and this town are bringing arms and ammunition. There's plenty of arms to be sold at Albany as yet, but we hear, by order of the Major, no powder is to be sold for the present there. The spirit of liberty runs high there, as you have doubtless heard by the post to our headquarters. I have extended myself to disseminate the same spirit in King's District, which has of late taken surprising effect. The poor Tories at Kinderhook are mortified and grieved, and are wheeling about and begin to take the quick step. New York government begins to be alive in the glorious cause and to act with vigor. Some this way say that the king's troops will carry off all the plate, merchandise, and plunder from the town of Boston, to pay them for their ignominious expedition, which, in my opinion, would not be at all inconsistent with the shameful principles of those who sent them on so inglorious an expedition. I fervently pray, sir, that our council of war may be inspired with the wisdom from above, to direct the warlike enterprise with prudence, discretion, and vigor. Oh, may your councils of deliberation be under the guidance and blessing of heaven. Since I began to write, an intelligent person who left Ticonderoga Saturday before last informs me that, having went through there and Crown Point about 3 weeks ago, all were secure, but on his return he found they were alarmed with our expedition and would not admit him into the fort. That there were 12 soldiers at Crown Point, and he judged near 200 at Ticonderoga. That those forts were out of repair and much in ruins, that it was his opinion that our men would undoubtedly be able to take them, and that he met our men last Thursday, who were well furnished with cattle, wagons laden with provisions, and in good spirits, who he supposed would arrive there last Sabbath day, and he doubted not that this week they would be in possession of those forts. He informed them where they might find plenty of ball, and there are cannon enough at Crown Point which they cannot secure from us. That he saw the old sow that is taken into siege at Louisburg, and which was a big cannon, the old sow, from Cape Breton, and a number of good brass cannon at Ticonderoga. Should the expedition succeed, and should the council of war send up their order for the people this way to transport by land 20 or 30 of the best cannon to the headquarters, I doubt not but the people in this country would do it with expedition. We could easily collect 1,000 yoke of cattle for the business. Since I wrote you the last paragraph, an express has arrived from Benedict Arnold, commander of the forces against Ticonderoga, for recruits, in consequence of which orders are issued out for the detachment of 18 men of each company in this regiment to march immediately, who will be on their way this day. I am with great respect, sir, your humble servant, Thomas Allen. It's the end of that letter. Now, this letter shows how complicated and extensive was the business devolving on Mr. Allen. He ascertained the state of things at Ticonderoga and Crown Point, finds where ammunition can be obtained, corresponds with New York, goes over in person to the King's District, and gives the glorious cause there a fresh impulse, furnishes important information respecting the attitude of the Indians, anticipates the need there will be at Boston for the cannon in Ticonderoga, and offers to collect 1,000 yoke of cattle to transport them thither. And while in the midst of all this, he is arrested by the arrival of an express from Arnold demanding recruits, and stops long enough to add that 18 men from each company are detailed for the service. The next day, Ticonderoga surrendered to Ethan Allen, creating great exultation throughout the New England colonies. Thomas Allen sent off his post in every direction, speeding the glad news. Throughout the summer that followed, Washington laid close siege to Boston. He was, however, very much crippled in his operations for want of cannon, and next winter Knox volunteered to go to Ticonderoga and transport some of those in the fort across the country. Had Allen's proposition been accepted in May, they would have been at Boston as soon as Washington was. So just to stop here, a couple of different things is that was very, very interesting is that here was a pastor that really understood what it was necessary to act. And one of the things that I always talk about is the extensibility of the gospel. That means that we knowing that God has us working in every aspect, and he works in every aspect of life. So one of the key components that Thomas Allen brought to bear was the fact that, hey, you need to follow up right away. And this is important in life, kids, is that when we do different things, you can have a success. And if you don't follow up appropriately on that which you accomplish, it's like, playing, I guess, basketball would be a good example. When you play basketball, you take a shot, and sometimes you have to follow up on that shot. You have to follow up with a court press, you make the basket, and you get in there, and all of that. So, there's a strategy and reason and good value, and here it proves out, is that if they would have brought those cannons down right away, Washington would have had them and been able to take Boston a lot sooner instead of being stalled. So, as we go on, as we look at this, and we see that Knox took no means of transportation from the army, relying entirely on the inhabitants of the Western Front to furnish them. Allen was foremost in responding to his call, and soon a train of 42 sleds laden with over 50 guns and 2,000 pounds of lead was seen slowly traversing the wilderness towards Boston. In a short time, they were frowning from Dorchester Heights, which means they were being aimed from Dorchester Heights, and under their stern and threatening aspect, the British fleet dropped down the bay, and the city became untenable. After the Battle of Long Island and the fall of New York, which sent much discouragement throughout the land, Allen could no longer remain at home, an idle spectator of the conflict, and set out for the army at Kingsbridge and offered his services as chaplain. In the movements and battles that followed after the army broke up its positions at Harlem Heights until it commenced its said retreat through New Jersey, he bore a conspicuous part. Like Gano and others, he did not consider his duty limited to preaching to the soldiers and praying with them, but felt called upon to furnish an example of courage in danger and endurance under privation. A part of his journal kept by him at this time has been preserved by one of his descendants, now residing in Pittsfield, in which we get transient gleams of his life in camp. Among others, we find such entries as the following, evidently made in a great hurry and jotted down perhaps on the head of a drum or the crown of his hat. First one, October 23rd, and this is a quote. So October 23rd, at White Plains, I saw our men bringing in a Hessian on a sort of briar, who was wounded in the leg. There had been an action just before between a party of our men and the enemy. We killed between 10 and 20 of the enemy and took 2 prisoners whom I saw. The Hessian's leg was broken. As he was brought in, the multitude behaved badly. The Hessian behaved well, took off his hat to the crowd. He was a rifleman dressed in green faced with white, was very dark, owing to his long voyage of 20 weeks, had arrived only 3 weeks before. The end of that note. Now, on October 24th, at night struck our tents, moved off 4 miles towards White Plains. This night encamped without a tent upon the ground. October 25th. All day, under arms, in continual expectation of an attack from the enemy, who appeared parried, in sight, marching and countermarching. A great battle expected to be at the door. Night after this day lay also on the ground under a brush shelter. Saturday, October 26th. Sun rose clear, the enemy near, a great battle drawing on. The end of his notes there. The later part of October, with its frosty nights, was not a good time for a young clergyman to begin sleeping on the ground in the open air. Yet to one in whose bosom the fire of patriotism burned with such a fervent glow as his, these privations and exposures were unthought of and do not receive a passing notice. He says, quote, "Yesterday forgot to dine. This day made excellent dinner on bread and butter only, being in a continual expectation of a cannonade from the enemy, who now lay in plain sight at the distance of little more than half a mile." End quote. He is not a mile or two from camp, in the hospital with the surgeons, but in full view of the enemy, snatching his dinner of bread and butter, with his eye watching the gleaming lines and the long rows of cannon within point-blank shot, and whose thunders may at any moment bring his frugal repast to a close. Quote, "Kindled up our fires after dark, and began our retreat with General Bell's brigade in the most excellent order, keeping out our flank guards, etc." Quote, "Lord's Day, October 27th. Arrived at break of day at White Plains, having performed a march of above 12 miles in the night. Lay down after daylight for sleep on the ground." End quote. They had not lain long before the sharp rattle of musketry roused them from their repose, and the march recommenced. The balls flew thick around the chaplain, but the only remark he makes about it is, quote, "Encamped on White Plains in our tent, having been marvelously preserved in our retreat." End quote. Then again, quote, "Dr. Wright of New Marlborough was buried this day. Such a confused Sabbath I never saw." End quote. The retreat under fire, the booming of cannon at intervals, shouts and orders of officers, the pealing bugle, and the fierce roll of the drum giving way at last to the almost equally great tumult of pitching the camp, might well make a Sabbath day long to be remembered. The whistling of bullets near him had more than once reminded him from what he had reminded him from what a scene of confusion he might, in a moment, be called away to the still land, where the tread of armies is never heard, and the sound of battle never comes. In the battle of the 28th, he occupied a position where he could see distinctly every movement of the hostile line, and towards the close of it, when the militia under General McDougall fled, he, in his eagerness to help save the army from defeat, hurried forward to offer his service as a volunteer. One sees occasionally in Mr. Allen's letters and journal that, in his earlier days, he had read military history with more than ordinary care. This is evident from the following short entry in his diary, in which he unconsciously reminds us that, amid the terrific cannonade and rattle of small arms, and smoke and confusion of the conflict, he forgot everything in the maneuvering of the two armies, looking to that more than to the effect of the cannonade, and indicative of the final result. Quote, October 28th. About 9 o'clock a.m., the enemy and our parties were engaged. About 10, they appeared in plain sight, falling off towards our right wing. A strong cannonade ensued from both armies. A great part of the enemy's strength seemed bent towards our right wing, but no additional force of ours was as yet directed that way. At length, the enemy came up with our right wing, and a most furious engagement ensued by cannonade and small arms, which lasted towards 2 hours. Our wing was situated on a hill. This was Charton's Hill, and consisted of, perhaps, something more than a bridge of Maryland forces, The cannonades and small arms played most furiously without cessation. I judge more than 23 cannon in a minute. At length, a reinforcement of General Bell's brigade was ordered from an adjacent hill where I was. I had an inclination to go with them to the hill, that I might more distinctly see the battle and perhaps contribute my mite to our success. Just as we began to ascend the hill, we found our men had given way and were moving off the hill in some confusion, at which some elevated shots from the enemy came into the valley where we were very thick, one of which took off the forepart of a man's foot in about 3 rods of me. I saw the ball strike and the man fall. As none appeared for his help, I desired 5 or 6 of those who had been in the battle to carry him off. Others I saw carrying off wounded in different directions. With the rest, I retreated to the main body. Our men fought with great bravery. They were sore galled by the enemy's field pieces. The whole British force now drew up before the fortified heights on which Washington lay, but dared not attempt to carry them until the arrival of reinforcements on the 30th, when it was resolved to move en masse on the position. But that night a terrific storm of wind and rain set in, and when it cleared away, Washington quietly withdrew with his army to North Castle. The wind roared fiercely through the highlands, fanning into great fury the flames of the burning village, which lighted their pathway over the hills. How long he remained with the main army after this is not known, but it is evident that the formidable movement on the northern frontier soon called him thither, for when the news of Burgoyne's invasion was spreading consternation over the country, we find him at Ticonderoga, where St. Clair was posted to arrest the progress of the invader. So what we see is that he now goes up. He left the battle that was going on with Washington, and he goes back across and up into Ticonderoga, and he's there because of what's happening in that area. So let's continue. Believing in his courageous soul that Burgoyne's powerful expedition would be broken in pieces against this strong fortress, he looked forward in high spirits to the day of its arrival before it. He animated the men by his patriotic appeals and promised them that he would fight and fall by their side. Wow. I'm sorry, I gotta say again, that's pretty powerful for, a minister, especially those that, I know that this day and age here, and maybe as you grow up, hopefully we find ministers when you grow up that can be like this. Anyway, let's continue with the story. He would not only pray with them, but die with them. He saw the deep design of the British in this formidable movement and felt that its success would be a death blow to the colonies. He believed it, therefore, to be the duty of every man to die in his place rather than to suffer the enemy to pass this barrier. The only one of importance that crossed his march to the heart of New York State. He, for one, was willing then and there to offer himself up a sacrifice to his country, and he called on all to follow his example. They might be overborne, but even in their death inflicted, that, like Samson, a mortal blow to the enemy. His feelings and determination at this fearful crisis in our history, as they are exhibited in an address he made to the soldiers when the enemy was drawn up in battle array before them and an attack was momentarily expected, challenge our highest admiration. The American outpost towards Lake George after a mere show of resistance, had been driven in. The enemy had covered Mount Hope with artillery that completely commanded the road in that direction, while artillery and ammunition and stores were being hurried rapidly forward. The Thunderer with the battery train had come up and anchored in full view, while, to complete their dismay, the sun, as it rose on the morning of the 5th over the eastern hills, lit up the summit of Mount Defiance, glowing in scarlet uniforms, while between a long row of heavy brass cannon flashed in the early light and looked threateningly down into the uncovered works. This fearful apparition had come in night time, and as the officers gazed on it, they were filled with consternation, and St. Clair immediately called a council of war. For an attack was momentarily expected. Mr. Allen, too, gazed on the alarming spectacle, but while the council of war was discussing the best plan of retreat, he mounted the platform of a gun, and turning to the soldiers drawn up in the battle array, strove to arouse them to meet the coming shock like men. Every eye was turned on that frowning eminence, expecting each instant to see the white puffs of smoke herald the iron storm that should send death amid the ranks. In this fearful moment, when the fate of the colonies, as he believed, rested on their conduct in the next few hours, he thus addressed them. Quote, "Valiant soldiers, yonder," pointing to the enemy that lay in sight, "are the enemies of your country, who have come to lay waste and destroy and spread havoc and devastation through this pleasant land. They are enemies hired to do the work of death, and have no motive to animate them their undertaking. You have every consideration to induce you to play the man and act the part of valiant soldiers. Your country looks up to you for its defense. You are contending for your wives, whether you or they shall enjoy them. You are fighting for your children, whether they shall be yours or theirs. Your houses and land, your flocks and herds, for your freedom, for your future generations, for everything that is great and noble, on account of which only life itself is worth a fig. You will abide the day of trial. You cannot give back whilst animated by these considerations. Suffer me, therefore, on this occasion, to recommend to you, without delay, to break off your sins by righteousness, and your iniquity by turning unto the Lord. Turn ye, ungodly sinners, for why will ye die? Repent, lest the Lord come and smite you with a curse. Oh, our camp is filled with blasphemers and resounders with the language of the infernal regions. Oh, that officers and men might fear to take the holy and tremendous name of God in vain. Oh, that you would now return to the Lord, lest destruction should come upon you, lest vengeance overtake you. Oh, that you were wise, that you understood this your latter end. I must recommend to you the strictest attention to your duty and the most punctual obedience to your officers. Discipline, order, and regularity are the strength of an army. Valiant soldiers, should our enemy attack us, I exhort and conjure you to play the man. Let no danger appear too great. Let no suffering appear too severe for you to encounter your bleeding country. God's grace assisting me, I am determined to fight and die by your side rather than flee before our enemies or resign myself to them. Prefer death to captivity. Ever remember your unhappy brethren, made prisoners at Fort Washington, whose blood now crieth to heaven for vengeance and shakes the pillars of the world, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not charge our blood on them that dwell on earth? Rather than quit this ground with infamy and disgrace, I should prefer leaving this body of mine a corpse on the spot. I must finally recommend it to you and urge it on you again and again in time of action to keep silence. Let all be hushed and calm, serene and tranquil. Let the word of command may be distinctly heard and resolutely obeyed. And may the God of heaven take us all under his protection and cover our heads in the day of battle and grant unto us his salvation. That was the end of the quote of what he said to the troops. And now we continue with what Mr. Headley writes. Noble and brave heart, how little he thought at that very moment when he was pouring his own heroic spirit into the troops and nerving them to the high resolution to stand or die at their posts, saying that he would stand and die with them. It had been resolved in a council of war to abandon those strong works, the key of the north, and retreat through the wilderness. The announcement of this decision fell like a thunderbolt upon him. It is difficult to say whether despair or scorn predominated in his bosom when he saw the army defile out of the works, leaving all the artillery, ammunition, and baggage behind, the prey of the enemy, and take up its perceptive, disorderly flight southward. A catastrophe so sudden and unexpected overwhelmed him. It seemed a dream that those strong defenses, so gallantly won by the beginning of the Revolution by a hand of brave men and hitherto so firmly held, could be abandoned without one blow being struck for their preservation, and arms and stores gathered with such expense and care abandoned to the proud and exultant foe. It had never occurred to him that the commanding officers would be found wanting in this terrible crisis. Hence, all his efforts had been with the men to make them, who were accustomed to the sight of carnage and the shock of arms, firm and steadfast. And when the infamous deed was done, he did not stop to consider what rules of the martinet had influenced the officers in their action. It was enough for him that the guns, shotted and primed, slept dumb in their places and were not allowed to speak for freedom. He was one of those men who did not look upon defeat as the most direful calamity that could happen. A great example was next in value to a great victory to a country struggling to be free. A fierce-fought battle, though disastrous, made heroes, while a disgraceful, hasty retreat made cowards. Thermopylae did as much for Greece as Plataea, and Leonidas made more heroes than Pausanias. He had told General Pomeroy that, quote, in his reading of history, he had noticed the great general seldom, if ever, made proper use of victory, end quote. He had also seen that without conflicts, troops are never made brave. He did not retreat with the army to Saratoga, and though it does not appear at what point or how he left it, it is evident he took his departure with feelings of the deepest disgust. He would not stay with an army whose commanding officers he considered politrons and more worthy of court-martials than of positions of trust. He returned home discouraged and indignant. He felt that he commanded at Ticonderoga its ramparts, though carried at last by the overwhelming foe, would first have been baptized in blood. That these feelings were not an ebullition of the moment, but the result of calm and sober reflection, is evident from the following note appended to the above address and written several weeks after and subsequent to the Battle of Bennington. Quote, in about 5 hours afterwards, he scornfully writes, the garrison was evacuated and our vast army fleeing before the enemy's with the utmost precipitation and irregularity, leaving behind for the use of the enemy an immense amount of baggage, artillery, ammunition, provisions, and every warlikeness necessary. How are the mighty fallen, and the weapons of war perished? A short time will decide the fate of America. It must depend on the treatment of those 5 general officers who gave up Ticonderoga and whose 175 Tory traitors taken in the militia battle near Bennington. If these cannot be brought to justice, then I am ready to pronounce what is, in my opinion, the sad doom of these states. The end is to come. Quote, your end is come, your destruction draweth nigh. And he continues, justice is one of the pillars of civil government, without which it cannot exist and last amongst them. End quote. Pretty much what's going on right now in our present day is that we're having a difficult time with justice. We have an internal enemy again. We have our modern day Tories, our traitors, that are using the cover of our Constitution to take and effect the destruction of America. And that would be all of, as I've talked about before in other programs in that I will leave and will focus on continuing with this letter. As he says, and as Mr. Headley says, these views did not spring from a naturally fierce and warlike spirit, for he was distinguished for the kindliness of his nature and the warmth and tenderness of his feelings, but from his judgment. For like the clergy generally of New England, he was thoroughly versed in the history of nations and was governed by views more comprehensive and statesmanlike than those whose knowledge was confined to technical military rules. Though Mr. Allen returned home, disgusted with St. Clair, the moment he received the call of Stark, asking the Berkshire militia to rally to the defense of Bennington, against which Colonel Baum with his band of Hessians was advancing, all his old energy returned. He knew Stark, and that whatever he commanded, there would be a fierce fighting, whatever the result might be. This gallant officer, though smarting under the insulting conduct of Congress that did not hesitate to appoint and promote inferior officers and neglect good ones, still loved his country. He would not serve under a Congress that he despised, but he would keep his own state from the foot of the invader. Allen took an active part in rallying the Berkshire militia to his aid, and accompanied them in their rapid march to his camp, which they reached on the morning of the 16th of August, just before daylight. They arrived in the pouring, thundering shower, and though drenched to the skin, Mr. Allen immediately sought an interview with Stark. Still smarting under the disgrace of Ticonderoga, the brave divine this time determined not to waste his efforts on the soldiers, but to tell the commander beforehand that they had not obeyed his call, and marched thither to join an ignominious retreat, but to fight. He therefore said to him plainly and bluntly, quote, General Stark, the Berkshire militia have often been summoned to the field without being allowed to fight. Now, if you don't give them a chance this time, they will never turn out again. End quote. Stark, a hero himself, loved to hear the ring of the true metal and was assumed instead amused. He was amused, not assumed. He was amused instead of offended at the gallant bearing and outspoken fearlessness of the young clergymen, and smiling, he replied, quote, Do you wish to march now while it is dark and raining? End quote. Then, no, not just at this moment. Well then, said the former, if the Lord will give us sunshine tomorrow, and I do not give you fighting enough, I will never ask you to come out again. The Lord did give them sunshine, and the morning drum roused up the soldier to a beautiful a day as ever blessed the world. A brisk west wind shook the raindrops in a shower of pearls from the surrounding forest. The blue sky bent tranquilly above the gentle stream, on whose banks they stood in martial array, and all was bright and peaceful. During the forenoon, while the several columns were marching to the various positions assigned them, one of the militia remarked to Mr. Allen, quote, We will do our own fighting today. End quote. Yes, he said, we shall have a good time at the enemy, but we are not quite ready yet. We must first join in prayer. End quote. And there, under the August sky, he lifted up his earnest prayer that God would give them victory. He had no intention, however, of doing the praying and letting his congregation do all the fighting. He meant to fight himself, and if the example of their pastor could make them brave, he resolved there should be no cowards among the Berkshire men that day. When they came in sight of the Hessians, and just before the attack commenced, he advanced alone in front, in his clerical gown, and mounting a stump, called out in a voice distinctly heard by them to surrender and to save the infusion of blood, promising them generous treatment if they would. The only reply to his summons was a volley of musketry. As the bullets whistled around his ears, one passing through his hat, he descended from his stump and returned to the ranks. When the battle commenced, he did as he resolved to do at Ticonderoga. If commander had given him a chance, fought in the ranks with the soldiers. Some of his parishioners stood around him, and among them a brother. Seeing that he was a better marksman than his brother, he said to him in the midst of the battle, Joe, you load, and I'll fire. So they fought side by side God's own battle on that warm August day. At the final charge, he led the militia and was among the first over the breastworks, and heard with an excellent, overflowing heart the shout of victory go up from the blood-stained heights. No sooner was the battle over than he devoted himself with his accustomed tenderness and energy to the wounded. Amid the Hessian steeds straying over the heights without masters, he came across a surgeon's horse loaded with panniers of wine. While the others were roaming the field in search of plunder, he seized on these and immediately distributed them to the wounded and weary, and moved like an angel of mercy among friends and foes alike. 2 large square crystal bottles he carried home with him as trophies of the fight, which were long preserved in his family as choice relics, and in which the health of the gallant old patriot was often drunk in the juice of the current. The night succeeding the battle, and the following day, he ministered to the disabled and dying, and on the third day, Saturday, mounted his horse, and making a long journey, reached his parish that night and preached the next day. It is a pity that the sermon and service of that Sabbath have not been preserved. They would doubtless remind one of the song of Miriam that rose so sublimely from the shores of the Red Sea, strewn with the wreck of Pharaoh's host. This great battle and victory were the theme of every tongue, and the part Mr. Allen bore in it a subject of general comment. One of his parishioners, hearing that he fought like a common soldier, came to him and inquired if it was so. Yes, he said, I did. It was a very hot, close battle, and it became every patriot to do his duty. Well, but, said this parishioner, Mr. Allen, did you kill anybody? No, he replied, I don't know that I killed anybody, but I happened to notice a frequent flash from behind a certain bush, and every time I saw that flash, one of our men fell. I took aim at that bush and fired. I don't know that I killed anybody, but I put out that flash. Ah, but for the clergy of New England, it is doubtful if the flash of the enemy's guns in the Revolution would ever have been put out. At the close of the next year, his brother Moses of Georgia, also a chaplain in the army and one of the most influential, uncompromising patriots in the state, and fearless like himself, was taken prisoner in the battle before Savannah, where he exposed himself to the hottest of the fire, and with unheard of brutality put on board a prison ship. Here he suffered every indignity that could be conceived for weeks, and then threw himself overboard and attempted to swim ashore. Unequal to the task, he was drowned, leaving a young wife and infant son in the new country without her home burned to the ground, and the congregation amid which she had lived scattered in every direction by the merciless foe. Thomas, unwilling to leave her thus unprotected and alone, determined to bring her to his own home. This was not so easy a task, but with his accustomed energy, that never would permit obstacles, however formidable, to deter him from a purpose once formed, he set out to make the long journey on horseback. In those early times it would have been sufficiently arduous had the country been at peace and the most public thoroughfares open to him. But with the country distracted by war, all the cities of the seaboard in the hands of the enemy, forcing him to skirt the dangerous frontier, it was one full of peril. Of the hardships he underwent and the dangers he escaped in his journey, there remains no record. We only know it took him 11 days to reach Baltimore. There they were sufficient, it seems, to prevent him from returning the same way, and he chose to nearly equally dangerous one of returning by water. Protected by heaven, however, he escaped the enemy's ships, and at length had the gratification of seeing the widow and her son under his own roof in Pittsfield. During the famous Shay's rebellion, which reached to his own country, he took prompt and decided ground on the side of the government. His powerful influence, which the insurgents could not make head against, so exasperated them that they openly threatened to seize him and carry him as hostage to New York State. This threat, however, was easier made than executed. A man who had stood unmoved amid who had stood unmoved amid the carnage of battle and carried his life in his hand through the long struggle of the Revolution, was not one likely to yield tamely to a lawless rabble. He openly defied them and slept with loaded arms in his bedroom, ready to shoot down the first miscreant that dared attempt to lay a hand upon him. None were found willing to make the hazardous experiment. They thought, in this case, discretion to be the better part of valor, and left him alone. In 1799, his eldest daughter, who had married Mr. William P. White, a merchant of Boston, died in London, leaving an infant behind without a relative in the kingdom to care for it, her husband being in the East Indies on business. His heart, great as his courage, was moved by the friendless condition of this infant grandchild, and he resolved at once to go for it. His affections were strong as his will, and when impelled by either, it was no common obstacle that could arrest him. Bidding in his congregation an affectionate farewell, he embarked on board a ship, Argo, for London. On the way, they were pursued by a large vessel which they took to be a French ship of war. The captain was alarmed and assembled all on board to deliberate on the course to be pursued. After a short consultation, it was resolved to fight, however unequal the contest might be, for a French prison could only be their fate if conquered, while they were certain to be thrown into one if they surrendered. In this extremity, Mr. Allen requested the captain to let him pray with the men and make a speech to them to encourage them to fight bravely. He gave his consent, and the voice that 20 years before had nerved American patriots to battle now thrilled the hearts of the little crew on board the Atlantic. The frigate continued to approach, but at length, to their great joy, she ran up the British ensign. Mr. Allen then assembled passengers and crew and offered up fervent thanksgiving to God for their escape. In England, he formed the acquaintance of John Newton, Rowland Hill, and others through whom his warmest sympathies became enlisted in the subject of foreign missions, which he showed by his earnest advocacy of them on his return home. He was absent from his congregation on this voyage nearly 6 months, his tempestuous return passage alone occupying 3 months, lacking 5 days. In those times of high political excitement between Federalists and Democrats, Mr. Allen was one of the few New England divines that sympathized with the latter. In the present day, the patriotic clergy of the Revolution are often looked upon as good, zealous men and nothing more, while in fact they were the soundest statesmen of the time. This was the case with Mr. Allen, and the jealous eye with which he watched every step of the civil government during the war showed how keenly he felt the danger of illegal authority springing up in the midst of revolution. Those decisions would lead to after trouble. Thus, in 1779, a session of the Supreme Court was appointed in Great Barrington. He immediately drew up an able remonstrance against it, on the ground that it was a dangerous precedent to consent to the oppression of law until a constitution or form of government or Bill of Rights had been adopted. This paper is still preserved in the family and shows a clear head and a far-reaching political wisdom not commonly found in turbulent times. It does not come within the plan of his work to write his biography as a clergyman to its close. He was an impressive preacher, and on occasion that called forth the tender feelings such as sacraments of the Lord's Supper would drown his audience in tears. He preached 46 years, faithful to his high calling as he was to his country. When prostrated by his final sickness, he approached the grave serene and tranquil. No cloud darkened his portals, no doubt dimmed the clear vision of his faith. Resting not on his own merits, but on his crucified Lord, in whom he trusted without wavering, he murmured in sweet peace, quote, "Come, Lord Jesus, come quickly." End quote. Just before his death, one of his children urged him to take some nourishment, saying that it would be impossible for him to live if he did not. "Live?" he exclaimed, the dying patriot and saint. "I am going to live forever." Thus, February 11th, 1810, at the 68th year of his age, passed away this great and good man, noble by nature, an earnest Christian, a faithful minister of the gospel, a brave patriot. His name should be inscribed on a high monument that commemorates his country's independence. Wow, what an amazing guy. So one of the people and one of the things that about Thomas Allen that I learned is that he was an anti-federalist. He was one, like Samuel Adams, that wanted to ensure that there was that the Constitution didn't become dangerous, and that a precedent could be set under it, and that there needed to be a good form of government and a Bill of Rights adopted. And that was in Massachusetts itself, which earlier Sam Adams and John Adams helped write. But when it came to the federal Constitution, so he was talking about in 1779 that we needed to have that Massachusetts needed to have that, and that as a nation they needed to have that, and then as it worked then towards 1787. So moving from what Massachusetts may or may not have had, and then was developed. Amazing. I think that there was so many different things in here I have to take, and I'll put into the notes for this, and kind of try and bring out a few things as I post it up online. And so those that are watching this online, you can read in the notes in YouTube or on SamuelAdamsReturns.net in the archives of this. Chapter 13, Thomas Allen, one of the most remarkable men that we could read, and knowing that he was a faithful minister as much as a great patriot. Wow, so much to ponder, so much for you children to ponder and take in, and know that patriotism and godliness and love of country and standing up for what is right comes all together in that, what I call, and what you've heard here, is the extensibility of the gospel. Following up, following through on what you do, being determined, knowing that what is right, you do right, and you do it well. Great examples, great things that are in this lesson.